They say that in this narration, the Prophet meant to say this. In other words, the right of a husband over his wife is almost equal to the right of Allah over his servants. These two rights have been brought so close together. The Prophet intended to convey this. Because after all, prostration is something done only for Allah. But if it were ever to be done for a human, it would be done for the husband. So it means that his right is as great as Allah's. This is a fabricated narration. Man and woman are considered like two halves of an apple. You know, the idea is that when they come together, they become complete. They become a whole apple. No, that's not the case. Everyone is a whole apple on their own. When they get married, they come together as two separate apples. If there is no obedience, it's as if his manhood is being disregarded, and it turns into an issue of authority. We shouldn't see this as a matter of authority. In fact, exercising authority itself is actually a problem.
Hello to everyone from Istanbul School. Dear viewers, today we will discuss the issue of obedience between men and women in the context of religion. Our guest is Dr. Hidayet Şefkatli Tuksal. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
How are you?
Thank God I am well.
May God grant you goodness. Professor, we would like to look at the relationship between men and women in the context of obedience. When we look at it from a religious perspective, we generally see a viewpoint that the woman should obey the man. How should we interpret and understand this? Is this the correct way to relate the issue? Why do we feel the need for the concept of obedience here?
Now, of course, since the concept of obedience appears in our authentic texts, this topic is on the agenda. But even if those texts did not exist, in a male-dominated system, well, a male-dominated system is actually not just a system that regulates relationships between men and women. It is also a system that regulates relationships among men themselves, and it is a hierarchical system. In hierarchical systems, it is expected that people in the lower hierarchies obey those in the upper hierarchies. That is, that they accept being governed by them and comply with their orders, demands, and wishes. This is not something unique to Muslim societies. In fact, it is like this all over the world. For example, if you look at the corporate system right now, you know, there is a certain point that human rights discourses have reached, but still, in work relationships and elsewhere, the concept of obedience persists. Even if it is dressed up or changed in different ways, it still exists. In the end, when relationships are structured hierarchically, the issue of obedience comes up. That's why in the Quran there is obedience to God, obedience to the Prophet, obedience to those in authority, or women's obedience to their husbands, or women's obedience to God. These are things that have come up in various contexts. But when it comes to filling in the content and giving meaning to these, of course, later generations and jurists have somewhat expanded or made these matters stricter. There have been some changes.
Teacher, there is a narration that is talked about a lot. If I were to command anyone to prostrate to another, I would have commanded a woman to prostrate to her husband. This narration has been accepted as an authentic hadith, and even today there is still a perspective that supports a woman prostrating to and obeying her husband. How should we interpret this? What kind of meaning do you think this has?
Now, this is actually a very convenient narration. It is considered to be among fabricated hadith narrations. In other words, this narration is not found in any authentic hadith book. It is something that has been deemed fabricated by hadith scholars and included in books of fabricated hadiths, that is, collections where such narrations are gathered. However, because obedience to men is equated with obedience to God in this narration, it is one of the narrations that especially preachers or scholars who give advice to the public love to use. That's why people hear it so often that they consider it an authentic hadith. We don't see this narration in the main hadith collections, but we do see it in the commentaries on hadith. Especially in narrations about women being deficient in intellect and religion, The hadith commentators and scholars who explain these have always used this narration. So why do they use this narration even though it's not authentic? They say that the Prophet meant to say the following in this narration. That is, a husband's right over his wife is almost equal to God's right over his servants. These two have been brought very close to each other. They claim that this is what the Prophet intended to say, because prostration is something that is done only to God. But you know, if it were to be done to any human, it would be done to the husband. So that means his right is as great as God's. Now, this is a fabricated narration, but its impact has really been significant in our society and in Muslim societies. Its influence has been strong, and except for acts of disobedience, women are expected to obey their husbands. For example, if your husband tells you to drink alcohol, you don't have to obey that. Or, I don't know, if he tells you to do something that is forbidden or prohibited in Islam, you shouldn't obey that either. But it has been understood as, in all matters that are permissible, you are obliged to obey whatever he wants. Now, some might say, what's wrong with that? What's the big deal? I mean, women should just obey their husbands. But this is not such a simple matter, because it turns into something like this. For example, obedience to a woman's father is also discussed. That is, especially if she is not married, obedience to the male members of her family. But these things are not talked about as much. But obedience of a woman to her husband is talked about a lot. In fact, it's even said that if a woman goes out without her husband's permission, the angels curse her. If a woman gives something from the house to someone without her husband's permission, she is considered to have sinned. So it's always about asking for permission, being under his supervision, staying within the boundaries he sets, and living the way he wants, focusing your life, desires, wishes, everything on him, aligning everything with him. In other words, you disappear as a woman, or you transform yourself in such a way that your own wishes and desires no longer matter here. Those become secondary things. The person you put at the center as the primary focus is your husband.
It turns into a situation where the woman's autonomy and individuality are completely pushed into the background.
Yes, it turns into that. Actually, let me put it this way. Basically, I saw a Muslim psychologist use these expressions. He was saying that for us, men and women are always considered like two halves of an apple. You know, like when they come together, they become complete. You get a whole apple. No, that's not the case. Everyone is a whole apple. When they get married, they come together as two separate apples. It's not like they're a whole that completes each other. They're not half apples. And relationships should be built accordingly. I think this is a very healthy approach. In other words, no one should ever have to give up their unique individuality or personal traits. We should always respect and honor each other's boundaries and strive to create an environment where the relationship is not a rigid, hierarchical, commander-subordinate dynamic, but rather one of genuine human companionship, deep friendship, sincere love, and heartfelt affection. This is what's healthy. Otherwise, how healthy could a chain of command really be?
That was a very good example, Professor. So not two halves of an apple, but two whole apples. In other words, they can maintain their individual lives while also sustaining their marriage. This shows that a relationship where each person has their own space and their own opinions is also possible, in a way that we can't understand or accept today.
There's also this. The Prophet had, 8 or 9 wives. So which one was the half apple? I mean, who was it that became one with the Prophet like an apple? No, everyone kept their own individuality. Every woman who lived during the time of the Prophet had a different personality. In other words, no one gives up their personality just because they're getting married. Sure, we make some sacrifices to harmonize in relationships, but this is no longer the kind of sacrifice that actually needs to be made. To give up on yourself, to adapt by centering your entire life around another person. This isn't healthy in any relationship, not even in a mother-child relationship. It's not healthy in a marriage either, and it's not healthy in a friendship. In other words, for relationships to be healthy, everyone needs to be themselves first.
We see thinking about oneself as selfishness. I mean, when a woman values herself, puts herself first, it's generally seen as selfishness, and it's something that's frowned upon, something that's judged. We constantly see women in the family, in a relationship, as someone who has to sacrifice herself for her husband and children. This is seen as the reasonable, the ideal thing to do. But actually, this has no basis in religion. Should we see this more as a cultural structure, a patriarchal structure? Why hasn't this changed or transformed? It's a situation that still continues.
Well, honestly, for example, in Arab customs, women aren't actually this self-sacrificing. And this level of sacrifice isn't expected from women either. There, women are more often seen as sexual partners, for example, especially in polygamous environments. So the fatwas our jurists give, like saying a woman is not obliged to do housework or to breastfeed her child, are based on this. But of course, we don't live in such an environment. In societies where mothers are given more responsibilities, which is somewhat the case in Turkish society, in Arab society, women aren't burdened with as much responsibility, but we take on that responsibility. For us, it's more self-sacrificing. For example, in Arab society, if a woman's husband divorces her or passes away, as soon as her waiting period is over, she can easily marry another man. This is not something that's frowned upon. She marries her husband's friend or she marries her husband's relative. There were many such marriages during the time of the Prophet. These things are not seen as strange. But in our society, if a woman's husband dies and she has children, even if she goes hungry or is poor, it is expected that she will take care of her children without remarrying. In other words, if it's a man, he should remarry, and his new wife is expected to take care of his children. But if it's a woman, she is expected to stay with her children and take care of them herself. It is shameful for him to marry. That's why many young widowed women do not remarry if they have children. Or, generally speaking, they don't have many suitors either. Marrying virgins is generally preferred.
Because men are also looked down upon when they marry a widowed woman.
Well, of course. Of course, that's how it is. In the end, since we have a monogamous system, men want to choose a spouse who fits their ideals when making a choice. This means they want to make more advantageous marriages, both in terms of age and marital status. But times are changing. For example, nowadays we witness much more diverse and varied types of marriages. Fatherhood roles are also gradually changing. I know young men myself. I know many young people who take care of their children as much as the mother of the house does, who look after their kids, spend time with them, and help with the housework. I know young men like that. So there is this kind of transformation as well. But still, expecting more sacrifice from women is something that remains influential in our culture. That's why there are these discourses about selfishness. But here's the thing, a person has to protect their own health. People assume something. Now, no one would carry a 50-kilo sack of potatoes on their back unless they're a weightlifter or something. No one would carry a 50-kilo sack of potatoes and walk a kilometer with it. They know they can't do it because that's something physical. But there's also an emotional burden equivalent to that. There's something that feels just as heavy to you, but this isn't visible. Because it's not visible, women are always expected to bear these emotional burdens, whether it's their husband's violence, psychological abuse, or, incompatibility. There could be many other heavy emotional burdens to carry, but we expect them to bear all of these. Why? Our grandmothers carried these.
Yes.
They said, "Sir, I vomited blood and drank cranberry sherbet." What happens in the family stays in the family. But what about how many illnesses those women suffered? How unhappy they were? What are we supposed to do about that? So maybe they didn't have a solution today back then. They had no other choice. But today, if people have options, we can't expect them to do the same. And also always expecting change from women, always expecting sacrifice from women. This is not something that can be done alone. If we truly want healthy families in our lives, if we truly want to be happy with our families, if we want to create secure attachment models, then both women and men have a big role to play here. Together, we all need to be willing to change and transform ourselves. In other words, it doesn't work without doing this.
Again, as you said, when it comes to generational change and transformation, the responsibility is placed on women, on mothers. Because since it is the mother who raises the child, they assume that the better, the more different, the more suitable for the times the child she raises is, the more she becomes the pioneer of a new generation. But here again, it seems like the father's role is being overlooked, Professor.
It's not just the father's role, though. I mean, the father's role is being overlooked. But the father, generally in our society, it's assumed that children are raised by their mothers, and that's the expectation anyway. And women already take on this responsibility wholeheartedly. However, based on my observations, and since I have raised 3 children myself, this is what I think. In other words, a mother's influence on her child is generally effective only until school age begins. After adolescence, it's almost entirely peer learning. Especially if the father factor is absent, if children haven't established a healthy relationship with their father, if there hasn't been healthy sharing, then the father is almost completely absent from their lives after that. In other words, he just becomes part of the background. Men also tend to, avoid this responsibility a bit. Being a good father ends up meaning being a father who doesn't argue much with the kids. That's why the authority falls on the mother, and so does the responsibility of guiding them. So way too much burden is placed on her. I think by now psychology as a science has advanced, and so have many health sciences. So there are actually many aspects of this that relate to health. Therefore, there's nothing here to discuss from a religious perspective. What should be discussed is how we can have healthy, secure attachment relationships, relationship models where people make each other happy, don't torment one another, and don't violate each other's rights. These topics need to be discussed, modeled, and talked about on television and in meetings. In other words, young people need to be raised with these models from now on. When these models are absent, everyone maybe does things in their own way, perhaps with the excitement of the first marriage. But when the excitement fades and it comes time to share responsibilities and daily life, then either monotony sets in or problems begin. Marriage starts to become a burden for both parties. That's why if the religious community truly cares about the family, this issue can't be addressed solely with religious rhetoric or arguments. It absolutely needs to be approached from multiple dimensions.
I mean, there are constant claims that the institution of the family is deteriorating or falling apart, but we see that there is no real search for a solution or any behavior aimed at solving this issue. I mean, as you mentioned,
it's not enough. There are still some efforts and attempts, but they're not sufficient. In other words, these have not become a state policy.
You mentioned, Professor, about young men taking on household responsibilities, being involved at home and taking care of children. You said that we see these things being done. Yes, these things have started to be done, but we haven't yet reached the stage where they are considered as things that should be done. Even when these things are done, it's usually in a way that's hidden from my view, or people are reluctant to talk about it. It's not shown openly. I think a much bigger step will be taken when we reach the stage where these things are openly expressed and defended as the right thing to do.
Of course. I mean, as you said, these kinds of relationships stem more from people's own sensitivities, their helpfulness, or their sense of justice. Otherwise, this is not a national policy. I mean, even this isn't a national policy for us. For example, our kids finish high school. Even their basic self-care skills don't really develop properly. I mean, how many boys who have just finished high school today can sew on a button, hem their own pants, or, prepare a meal for themselves? We focus so much on our kids being successful at school that we neglect other life skills, and vocational training is already problematic. A generation is growing up like this, one that can't manage their own lives and hasn't developed their own self-care skills. So what happens then? Everything falls on the mother, especially if the father isn't involved either. I think this is something that needs to be discussed. How children should be raised, the roles of mothers and fathers, and relationship models. In other words, just a single relationship model. We can't get anywhere by constantly trying to organize things based on the prophet and his wives. Today, our biggest problem is that young people have to struggle with all kinds of addictions, like computer addiction, gaming addiction, gambling addiction, substance addiction.
I mean, all of these, many families are dealing with such problems, and honestly, they're very draining, both in terms of energy and morale. So there is a lot that needs to be done. In fact, we're actually in the midst of a very serious problem. If we return to the issue of obedience, Professor, we've now moved on to family problems and children, but the question I asked at the beginning was about obedience in the relationship between men and women. What is the connection between the concept of obedience as mentioned in religious sources and the current understanding of obedience? How should we interpret this?
As I said, obedience in religious sources is something specific to hierarchical societies. Now, hierarchies in our relationships have diminished. In the past, even the hierarchy between mother, father, and child was very strong. Currently, we live in child-centered societies. Hierarchies have been reversed. That's why, in other words, this relationship of obedience needs to be transformed. It needs to be transformed in a healthy way. So, for parents to expect unconditional obedience from their children, like this is just an empty dream, even if this were achieved, it wouldn't be healthy anyway. For a husband to expect this kind of obedience from his wife, or, things like that. I mean, even in commercial or business environments, we talk about something called governance. Yes, of course, the issue of obedience still exists, but in societies where the notion of human rights and the idea of equality are more established, even governance is discussed not as a top-down system, but rather as models and systems of governance in which everyone participates. This should also apply to us. In other words, we should implement these things in a peaceful manner. How do we become happier? How do we move forward together by being happier? By loving each other more, by helping each other more, by showing more solidarity? What kind of models can we create for this and how? So we need to look at it this way. Otherwise, if you assign men a position of authority here, if you put them in that seat, it turns into something that takes these relationships away from their naturalness. For example, fathers in the past were people who had no relationship with their children. In their old age, they become unhappy and lonely people. They end up having shared nothing with their children. After all, maybe it was like this once upon a time, but it doesn't have to be this way today. We can shape our relationships by drawing on established models or by trying to create new things ourselves. In other words, in a peaceful environment. Men shouldn't perceive this as an attack on their own will or their masculinity. This is the main issue here. If there is no obedience, no willingness to comply or follow, it's as if his masculinity is in some way being overlooked or simply disregarded. It emerges as a problem of power. We shouldn't see this as a power issue. Actually, the very act of exercising power is itself a problem. That's why I think it should be approached in a more peaceful way.
We need to establish healthier, more respectful and loving forms of relationships.
So what is important here? Is our goal to make a man say, I am a man who is obeyed very well? Or is it to be a healthy, harmonious and loving family? Which one? We need to look at it from this perspective.
We need to decide on our priorities.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your valuable insights. Once again, you have touched on very important points. Thank you, teacher.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dear viewers, today we discussed the concept of obedience in male-female relationships in the context of the Quran. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.